'Twas the night before the release of Counter-Strike 2, and all was quiet throughout the house, except for the sound of me desperately gathering CSGO data while I still could. So this video is even more important now than it would have been otherwise, because future comparisons are going to be a lot harder to make without an official build of the game available and playable online. So, for anyone who hasn't seen my previous video, here's where we're at. I noticed that mouse inputs in CS2 felt a lot worse than they did in CSGO, and I found that a ton of people across the internet agreed. They called it floaty, laggy, delayed, whatever vocabulary word you wanted to give it. But while people had their subjective experiences, we didn't have any objective measurements, so I set out to change that. I used the nvidia reflex latency analyzer and took some measurements. Now, part of the reason I made the video in the first place is I wanted to kind of kick the beehive and see what shook loose. I asked people to validate my findings themselves and to test themselves and figure out if this was just a me problem or if this was an everyone problem. And kick the beehive I did. I posted that video around midnight, and when I woke up the next morning, I had hundreds upon hundreds of comments on the video, the Reddit post everywhere. People were mentioning in droves that their mouse input also felt weird, and that when they went back to CSGO, it instantly felt more responsive, so it definitely wasn't just a me problem. But the second day after the video was up, that's when things really got interesting. It was one of the most awe-inspiring moments I've probably ever experienced on the internet. One of the holiest matrimonies of nerds that I've ever seen to date came together, and people were actually testing, and test they did. My inbox was filled with spreadsheets, different testing methodologies, console commands, launch options, suggestions on how to nail down that feeling that mouse inputs weren't quite right, and actually how to put it into numbers. And in today's video, we're going to be looking at pretty much all of those suggestions that I got. But first, before we dig into that, let's put last week's video to bed. Apparently, I managed to anger the powers that be because I made the joke, what if the Glock just had an animation lag this entire time? It would invalidate all my other testing. Turns out it is. However, the reasoning behind why the Glock is delayed is actually a really interesting property of the game engine itself. So shortly after I posted my video, a Reddit user named Towel Pitiful uploaded the first video to my knowledge demonstrating just how powerful subtick is in CS2. So in this clip, he's playing on a super low timescale, so it's much more noticeable. You can see right about here, he clicks his mouse while the crosshair is still at head level. Then, before the next tick of the server actually happens, he flicks off of his target. Now, the muzzle flash starts to begin as the next tick occurs, but due to the sub-tick system, it remembers where he was aiming when he initially clicked, and the shot lands precisely where it should at the instant that he clicked. Alright, freeze frame. Let me interrupt myself. Turns out this isn't the whole story. Right about as I was getting ready to render out this video and publish it, and call it a day, the void called out to me and made this haunted sound. So, my Discord server has effectively become the CS2 testing ground, which is pretty neat. But Kusanagi just dropped this knowledge bomb on me right as I was about to wrap up this video. He stated that your bullets do not go where you are aiming when you click.
Wow, but that's the exact opposite of what you said 1 minute ago.
They actually go back in time and are registered where you were aiming in the previous frame. Whereas in CSGO, they were actually registered on the next frame. Now it's the previous. I hope you like elevator music, because in order to actually measure this, I went ahead and limited my game to just 1 frame per second. I aimed at this filing cabinet on office in a hallway, and I pointed a camera at my mousepad. Then, I'm going to go ahead and flick my wrist extremely fast to the right, and click once my mouse gets to the edge of my mousepad. You can see that the muzzle flash went off pretty close to the ladder over here, but as I painfully turn around, there it is. An impact in the filing cabinet where I was aiming on the previous frame. If you're wondering how repeatable that is, here it is the second time. So let's switch gears over to CSGO instead, where I'm going to perform the exact same test. As you can see here, we get almost precisely the opposite behavior, where shots are registering with my mouse flick included. So what's happening here is the game only knows the position your crosshair is at, or the coordinates of where you're aiming, each time a frame is rendered. So when you click your mouse in between rendered frames, the game has to make a choice. In CSGO, that choice was that it would register your bullet path on the next frame that occurred. In CS2, however, it decides to register your bullet path using the previous frame's positional data. In theory here, CS2 system should be superior, since it doesn't have to wait for any data, since it already has it, since it's in the past. But in reality, in my personal opinion, it feels like you almost have to wait for CS2 to catch up with you, and you have to click slightly late in order for your shots to actually land on target. So, to drive home the point that Counter-Strike can only choose a bullet path based on the data present in a rendered frame, I went ahead and reran the exact same test. But this time, I did it with FPS_max 10 instead. Now, one other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to click my mouse in the middle of my swipe rather than at the end of my swipe like I did before. Alright, so let's watch that back one more time in super slow motion. And there's the bullet impact as shown by SV_show_impacts. And then this is the exact frame that my crosshair was pointing at, that exact pixel. So yes, in Counter-Strike, your bullet path can only be somewhere that was present in a rendered frame. So now the only outstanding question became, when did I click? I saw a lot of suggestions that included using an on-screen overlay that would display when you clicked, but that really wasn't going to work here because those are always delayed by 1 frame. The only thing that I found that would have extremely low latency and also provide super useful and accurate data was actually my microphone. I simply went ahead and put my mic directly above the mousepad, and here we are. I'm going to go ahead and break the 4th wall and bring you guys into my video editor. Hello and welcome. So, here we are. I've got 2 clips. One is from CSGO, and the other is from CS2. You'll notice that the CS2 clip is about twice as long, and that's for good reason. We'll get to that in just a moment. But as I was saying earlier, we had determined with FPS Max 1 that your bullets land roughly on the next frame that occurs in CSGO and the previous frame that occurs in CS2. And at FPS Max 10 here in this clip, we see the same behavior. So let me go ahead and play it back just so you can get an idea for what it looks like in its natural form. Wow, that was a lot faster than I was expecting. That was really difficult to see. But there you go. Now, if we go ahead and on the timeline here, you'll see in orange is my gameplay footage, and in yellow is my microphone, where you can kind of hear me click. So as we go to the next frame, right about here is where I clicked. And as we continue down the timeline, this is the next rendered frame. And you can already see in CSGO that it registered my shot on the frame directly after when I audibly clicked. So that behavior is pretty simple. However, when we go over to CS2, things get a little bit more interesting. I'm going to go ahead and play the clip once or twice. And it's worth noting, it looks like I flicked a little bit slower in CS2. However, when we go frame by frame, we start here at the temple, go to the hearth. Here is where you audibly hear me click. And as we continue on, you'll notice that there's no bullet impact here. And no bullet impact here. And still no bullet impact here. Actually, where it is behind me. So I'm going to have to completely turn around, and there it is, on the hearth at the entrance of Donut. So if we go back into the footage here, when I clicked, I was actually looking at the entrance of Donut, and the shot registered based on where I was looking in the previous frame. Now, it's worth noting that I did test this at FPS_max 10, just so that it's a little bit easier to see what I'm talking about. If you test this at 60 FPS or 100 FPS, the results are the same, it just becomes increasingly difficult to see. So, what is the actual implication here? Well, if you play at 500 frames per second, probably not much. But for anyone who plays on 60 FPS or 100 FPS, here's what could happen. In a very fast op flick, if you have one frame that was rendered just before your crosshair touched the enemy, and then one frame that was rendered just as your crosshair passed the enemy, it doesn't matter when you click your mouse. Scientifically, it is impossible for your shot to hit because your frame rate was too low. And that just kinda sucks. Well, as it turns out, this was actually an issue in Overwatch as well. And the Overwatch team actually went out and fixed it. They called it high precision mouse input. So, pre-high precision mouse input update, you can see what it looked like. As they flicked to the right, the game drew out about 16 white lines. Each of these white lines are a potential path that the bullet could have taken when the character flicked their mouse from left to right. However, after Overwatch enabled high precision mouse input, they used a combination of the actual refreshes in addition to time-stamped mouse data, which allowed the bullet to travel down any of the white lines or the red lines in the screenshot, effectively letting the player shoot between frames, which is just super sci-fi and super cool. Valve, if you're watching this, you should totally make this a thing in CS2, if it's possible. Alright, let's get back to the video and get off this tangent. The points that I make regarding mouse input are still valid in this video. However, the clicks registering on the previous frame could potentially be a big deal if you're someone who plays at low frame rate. Okay. Now, something that is notable is that this also means that all of your muscle memory from CSGO is completely invalid, especially when it comes to things like flicking with the op. Alright, so muscle memory out the window. Let's take a look at one more post that I saw on Reddit, which actually demonstrates this principle in way better ways than I could just verbally. Take a look at this one.
Here is the difference between shooting in CSGO and CS2. In CSGO, what you see is what you get. In CS2, what you click is what you get. Look again. Here I click left mouse button, and look who gets killed in which game. In CSGO, the bullet lands where you are holding the mouse at the moment of fire animation. In CS2, the bullet lands where you held the mouse when you clicked the button. In global offensive, delay between button click and hit reg is random between 0 to 16 milliseconds on 60 for tick and between 0 to 8 milliseconds on 128 tick. In CS2, hit registration is instant thanks to subtick, but the animations still wait for the tick to happen.
Alright, so now we understand how muzzle flash and tick rate and subtick all kind of meld together. But what does this mean in terms of my data from last week's video? Well, turns out, and this is something that I did not pay attention to whatsoever because I didn't even know it was a thing, the muzzle flash delay on 64 tick is almost double that on 128 tick. I recorded CS2 at 64 and CSGO at 128, which explains why I had drastically different numbers. That said, one thing I wanted to note is that while my video did get disproven within 48 hours, everyone who then came to the video after that time who already knew it was wrong were extremely civil. Everyone was just pointing out the Reddit post, pointing out the error, and referencing the video, and did so in a really kind manner. And I honestly can't say thank you enough to everyone for understanding both how complex the subject is and also not just spewing hate mail in my direction the moment the video got disproven. So you all rock for that one. Thank you. For reference, my old video now says debunked in the title, and it has a link taking people over to this video to help get them informed. So let's take a step back to the original problem. I am adamant that mouse input feels better in CSGO, and apparently so does a massive chunk of the player base. Now, it's worth noting, I'm not talking about something game-breaking here. You can still hop into either game, and you can have a fun time. You can hit your headshots. But without a doubt in my mind, the problem is both subtle, and it is there. It is present. Especially for anyone who's extremely sensitive to input latency problems, like I am. So, with that in mind, I spent the entire last week pretty much testing. I went back and forth between the two games, really paying attention to it. I made sure to only play on 64 tick servers, and I even actually got my global elite rank back on CSGO, which felt nice, of course. All I concluded through all my switching back and forth was that the input issue really, truly is there. I just had to find it. So first things first, let's go over my new testing methodology. As you might have seen in the last video, I painstakingly entered the results by going frame by frame in a recording. No more of that.
We're not cavemen! We have technology!
Battle Nonsense, who is actually really amazing at this type of testing, actually has a Excel template that allows you to import CSV files, which are generated by the NVIDIA Reflex Latency Analyzer tool, and his spreadsheet will automatically format that data and then display them in nice-to-read, pretty graphs. I cannot stress that enough that without this template from Battle Nonsense, this video would not have been possible within a week. It would have probably taken me 3 times as long for me to create these formulas myself. If you have a moment, his link is in the video description. Go give him a subscription. He does all sorts of amazing latency testing, probably much better than I ever could. For what it's worth, I did actually attempt to summon him via email. Hopefully he gets it, and hopefully he makes a return for CS2. Alright, so now that we've got our test setup in place, time to get testing. First up, let's go ahead and disprove my previous video. I tested a muzzle flash latency in CSGO at 64 tick, 128 tick, and then in CS2 at 64 tick. And there it is. Pretty much plain as the eye can see, those are my results from last week's video. As expected, muzzle flash is shown faster when you're playing at 128 tick than it is at 64. Now, I also got a lot of suggestions on the video to test using SV_show impacts, and that actually just has the exact same data as muzzle flash, probably because it's tied to the tick rate. So now we know. It's worth noting that going forward, all of my testing was done at 64 tick, unless otherwise noted, and I also used FPS_max 500 for some additional stability. More on that stability later. Now, this next test, single-handedly ended up consuming the majority of my week after work. A couple of comments suggested that I test with mouse movements instead. 3 Clicks Philip actually even made the same suggestion.
If he still wants to test the input lag, he could retest both games but with a mouse movement test instead of a gun firing test, which would be a better way to test whether mouse movements are different in CS2 than they are in CSGO. Just be careful not to get banned. That's what I'd be interested to see next. No pressure, no assumptions. As you can imagine, this whole thing has left me quite paranoid about saying anything with absolute certainty. And you should feel that way too.
Thanks for adding that bit about no pressure, Philip. Appreciate that one. Now, before we get into the next section, it's worth noting that you should not do any of this at home. You will get a VAC ban if you don't know what you're doing. So, with that out of the way, I initially tried with plus turn right, but unfortunately, turn right kind of gradually turns your character over a fixed amount of time instead of instantaneously doing so. The tool that I have here in front of me is designed to measure instantaneous inputs and their response times, so something gradual wasn't going to work. What I did find, however, was a Reddit post from Sheeps Don't Cry from years and years ago showing a 180-degree turn bind that was set to increase your sensitivity whenever you would hold down a key. Now, this was half the battle, but to actually initiate the actual turn, I still had to move the mouse, which really wasn't going to work. I needed to find a way to get left click to initiate the turn, and to do so instantly, accurately, and in a repeatable fashion so that I would have good data. And this is where auto hotkey came in. I ended up using Microsoft's mouse event DLL, which actually had pretty good documentation, and I used it to directly send data that I had moved my mouse 1 pixel to the right every time I clicked, in addition to actually left clicking, using the code I wrote here. This was the golden ticket. I could now repeatedly, accurately, and instantly turn a predefined amount every single mouse click. As you can see here, I'm actually spamming my mouse and it's moving 1 pixel to the right each time I click. The only thing I had left to do was remove my view model from the game, so the monitoring rectangle wouldn't pick up my mouse, or wouldn't pick up my knife, which might throw off the data. And voila! We had accurate, repeatable data for the latency of mouse movements, or at least as far as how long it would take to process and display that instantaneous movement in-game. So I tested CSGO at 64 tick. I also tested CSGO at 128 tick. Not that that should matter, but why not? I tested CS2 at 64 tick, and I tested CS2 with the frame rate uncapped. As shown, we can officially put the issue to bed. There is no CS2 input lag issue.
New evidence was presented and I changed my mind. I'm a scientist, not a idiot politician.
Or is there? See, this doesn't really explain the phenomenon that everyone has collectively noticed, where mouse inputs just don't feel quite right. So, I kept digging. And this one I didn't actually expect to do anything, but it was extremely interesting to do. So I did it. I'll cover this briefly. MarkC has a program that comes with a mouse recorder. It allows you to record your mouse inputs. When it's running, a command prompt window will actually spit out all of the raw data it receives in terms of the pixel movements of your mouse. So say 1 pixel down, 1 pixel right. A slow movement will show up as a whole slew of 1 pixel left, 1 pixel down, 1 pixel right, 1 pixel down. Whereas fast movements will show up as something like 5 pixels right, 1 down, 5 pixels right, 1 down. All I had to do then was take that raw data and use PowerShell to redirect the output of that executable into a text log file in order to log it, and then pop it open in Excel and use a ton of formulas to extract the data. In blue and in orange here, you can see it's just a few hundred samples of only the x-axis showing a turn, a 1-tap, and then a turn in CSGO, followed by a turn, a 1-tap, and then a turn in CS2. And if you don't know what to make of this chart, that makes 2 of us. But at least we found out there's no crazy mouse acceleration, or if there is, then I couldn't measure it. I didn't think there was any anyway, but I always wanted an excuse to mess with this program, and today was that day. Alright, so let's get out of the weeds. I think it's time to stop doing controlled scientific tests, and let's dive into the world of uncontrolled variables. Let's actually measure what it looks like when we play the games in question. So one additional feature of the reflex latency analyzer that I did not mention in the previous video, because I didn't know about it, is that in addition to measuring click to photon latency, it actually has a very in-depth performance logger, and it contains all sorts of data. It'll record average frame times, 1% low frame times, GPU fan speed, GPU voltage, all sorts of data. And the first thing that I went ahead and tested with this was the performance of a deathmatch and a casual game, just to get a feel for the tool and, you know, work out all the kinks and make sure that I understand how the data worked. Once that was out of the way, and I had a good feel for the tool and how it worked, I went ahead and inverted my video settings. So normally I play all low with MSAA turned on, so I went ahead and turned everything to all high with MSAA turned off, just to rule out that I didn't have some weird video setting conflict. And as expected, high settings performed significantly worse. But it did help establish a baseline of around 300 or so FPS for my CS2 gameplay. Next up was to go ahead and test a couple of death matches in CSGO, one more on CS2, and for fun, and also because I've noticed this, CS2 tends to feel worse the longer you play. So to test that, I went ahead and left CS2 open for 12 hours. So as it turns out, CS2's deathmatch servers don't actually kick you for inactivity. So while I was at work the entire day, I was repeatedly getting headshot while I was AFK at home. 12 hours later, I came back home to the sound of AKs firing. I sat down and recorded some numbers. Turns out my hunch was correct to some degree. Over time here, we can see the average SPS takes a massive hit, and the 1% lows are even worse. We went from a 400 average in CSGO to a 300 average in CS2 to a 250 average after the game had been open for a long time. Now, I didn't get a chance to test the 12-hour test in CSGO, but it was a pretty neat test. However, regardless of my ridiculous 12-hour test, we start to see something in those 1% lows. 1% lows are one of the best ways to quantify what a game feels like. It'll quantify those micro stutters, those inconsistencies, those little minute drops that are hard to detect that make a game feel sluggish. And they were definitely worse in CS2. So let's dive into those a little bit deeper. I took some full game 10-minute measurements from a Mirage and Dust 2 CSGO deathmatch. Then on Counter-Strike 2, I did 2 full-length deathmatches on Mirage and on Nuke. Following the trend from my previous measurements, CS2 gets a little bit lower average frame rates, but nothing really noteworthy. In the 1% lows, however, we can see an almost 50 FPS drop on average between CSGO and CS2 across all the results. Now, as a last-minute addition, I did also test a command that has been suggested to me more and more as the week goes on, called low latency sleep after tick set to true. People were saying that this smoothed out the frame inconsistencies, and while that is technically true, it actually lowered performance well and far and beyond what is reasonable, and I would recommend turning that setting off. Now, there is some information that I've read that command actually has some interactions with Vulkan, and in the patch notes, they mention some Vulkan fixes, so your mileage may vary. I don't have an AMD GPU, and Vulkan performs best on AMD graphics, so I don't know. Maybe try that command on an AMD card or an AMD card with Vulkan in the launch options and see what it does. But at least for anyone on Team NVIDIA, don't use it. All right. So there's a lot of information that just got bombarded into everyone's retinas. So what did we actually learn from all of this? Let's summarize. Across the board, you can see that the average frame rate in CS2 is just a touch lower, but nothing crazy. In the 1% lows, however, you can start to see enough of a drop that it's probably something you'll actually be able to feel in-game. That same behavior continues, of course, into the render latency charts, especially when we plot them directly against one another. You can see there's a lot more of those sharp peaks, or sharp spikes in latency in the CS2 chart. Alright. So given that data, let's make some conclusions. First up, there is not an input lag problem in CS2. However, what there is a decrease in performance across the board and an inconsistency in the frame times. Personally, I think that those 1% lows, those spikes in frame times, I think that's responsible for most of the feeling that mouse inputs are off, that they're sluggish, that they're inaccurate, floaty, whatever you want to call it. For anyone who's played CSGO competitively, you'll probably know what I mean when I mention your mouse feeling more sluggish when an exec is hitting your bomb site, right? When there's 3 smoke grenades out and 2 Molotovs, 2 HEs, and a flashbang all happening at the same time, right when it matters most, right when your bomb site that you're defending is getting exec'd, that's when you can suddenly feel your mouse is just dragging more than normal. That your frame rate has suddenly tanked. It's almost immersion breaking in CS:GO that you can instantly feel. You can feel the exec coming to your bomb site, right? And I think that precisely that feeling, I think that right there is the exact feeling of what's wrong with mouse input in CS2. The problem now, however, is that in CS2, it doesn't just happen when there's 10 grenades coming at you and they're all on your screen at the same time. It happens even in game modes without grenades. It happens during pistol rounds. It happens at all times. That feeling that you get in CS:GO when the exec is coming your way, that's the permanent state in CS2. And I think that is exactly the feeling I've been trying to nail down through all of this testing. However, this is actually really good news. Fixing frame times is something that's super easy to measure and something that'll naturally just occur over the game's life cycle. For proof of that, literally as I was recording this video, not 20 minutes ago, Valve just released an update with the following in the patch notes. Fixed a bug that caused hitching and improved the performance of Molotovs when they get extinguished. As for my data, however, I went ahead and did another round of testing, and the average frame rate, the 1% low frame rates, the render latency, everything was more or less exactly the same as it was when I started this video almost a week ago. But even though it's not fixed as of today, it does go to show how quickly these things can change. Alright, so that's the 1% low story. That's maybe why your mouse doesn't feel so great. Let's talk about everything else we learned in this video. We also learned that you should probably reboot your game often. It seems like the longer it's open, the lower performance seemingly gets. And it's pretty simple to do after a game, so why not? Of course, I only have a sample size of 1 for that test. I only left the game open overnight once, so your mileage may vary. We did learn, however, that you probably should not use the sleep after tick command, at least on NVIDIA GPUs. And the icing on the cake, we learned that tick rate, subtick, and client behavior is completely different in CS2 versus CS:GO. So you're going to have to relearn all your muscle memory on sprays and on op flicks all over again. Alright. I think that should put everything to bed. I also really can't go any further into debugging other than what I've shown here with the frame times. It's just the limitation of the tools that I have here in front of me. If I wanted to prove this any further, I'd have to get a solenoid to mechanically move my mouse in a repeatable fashion and then record vector data.